Hey mate, it's Cashew here. One of the most important things to the longevity and replayability of a Borderlands game is a solid endgame experience. Thus far, every Borderlands game has done it differently, with Borderlands 1 having pearl farming, Borderlands 2 having OP levels and raid bosses, BL3 having mayhem mode and takedowns, pre-sequel not having one, Wonderlands with many chaos chambers, and Tales from the Borderlands. Oh, I'm just kidding. As of recent though, it feels like there's been something missing from all of these endgames. Borderlands 1 doesn't have much for you to do besides I guess like the underdome after you get your pearls. Borderlands 2's OP levels were left notoriously unbalanced and forced you to use slag, which players were not happy about. Borderlands 3 forced you to play with mayhem modifiers if you didn't want to play on the max difficulty, along with the Guardian takedown just not being fun at all. And Wonderlands had nothing else to offer besides more and more chaos levels after everything was said and done. I've always played with potential endgame ideas in my head where I would just combine all the elements and just see what it would look like, but I think I have a pretty good idea for what I think the endgame could be. Okay, so first we need the chaos chamber back in, but instead of starting at 20 this time, we're gonna start at 100, no, 200, no, 300, 16,000 chaos level! Before we really get started here, I'm going to preface this by saying this pitch is 100% a pipe dream and will absolutely be way too much gearbox to put out healthily. But, let a man dream, right? So without further ado, this is my pitch for a Borderlands 4 endgame. Okay, so before we get into the Borderlands 4 pitch at large, I just want to take a good look at what each of these endgames did right so that we can apply them to our new concept. In Borderlands 1, pearls being the best items in the game and being extremely rare made them incredibly fun and super rewarding to farm. This definitely needs to return in some form. I think it's important to make every pearl broken, as to say they all wipe the floor with every enemy and boss besides maybe raids. It's important to make the distinction that pearls are not required for the endgame since they're the best guns in the game, but they are the endgame reward for sinking your time, effort, and skill into playing the endgame loot. You should still be able to make really powerful builds with only legendaries and uniques that can handle the endgame just fine. They need to strike the balance that Borderlands 1 did, where even if you have these crazy powerful pearls, you can still go back to your old reliable gun at any time, as it might even be your preferred option for specific phases of a raid boss or enemy type. Now let's talk about Borderlands 2's qualities. Arguably the best endgame in the franchise because of its impressive amount of raid bosses, rare loot, and the Digi-Peak challenge. But let's start with the bad here. The Digi-Peak challenge. It just struck peak was fun, but an overall negative for the endgame by making the meta smaller, some weapon and builds unviable, and making raid bosses way more difficult with no extra reward for it. I'm of course specifically talking about how OP10 doubled the health of Hyperius and Veracitus the Invincible. Needless to say, that can't happen again. But the peak does live on in the form of Borderlands 3's takedowns. It keeps the loot and challenge but removes the OP levels from the equation, which most fans agree was a good idea. And now onto what we can take away from Borderlands 2. Raid bosses, and the incredible amount of them. At Borderlands 2's launch, there were 2 raid bosses available to fight, and with each DLC, more and more were added until they had this absolute police lineup over here. This is why players kept coming back. You gear up, fight the raid bosses, get better loot from the raid bosses, use that loot to fight other raid boss and endgame challenges. Having this many raid bosses in the game also let people do raid rushes, where they would take on every raid boss back to back, which were always fun to play and watch. But I've been ignoring another key part of Borderlands 2's endgame, Seraph Crystals. If you didn't know, you would get Seraph Crystals from killing raid bosses or Seraph Guardians, and then you could spend them on items from each DLC's unique Seraph vendor. This was a banger idea and I'd love to see it return, but with additions made to the price and balancing of the weapons, different weapons should have different prices depending on how good they are is what I mean. A lot of the Seraph guns kind of just weren't that great, so I feel like if they're still going to remain expensive, they need to be worth it. Now Borderlands 3. I'm going to leave Mayhem Mode out of this discussion because the pitch both works with it and without it, but what I want to talk about in BL3 are the takedowns. Borderlands 3 included 2 takedowns, the takedown at the Maliwan backside, which was praised as one of the best endgame activities in the franchise, and the takedown at the Guardian Breach, which was called one of the worst endgame activities in the franchise. The difference between these two comes down to a few things: balanced gameplay, overall fun factor, but see, the Maliwan takedown is just extremely easy when you compare it to the Guardian takedown, and that's not to say that the Maliwan takedown's even that easy. All Guardian takedown enemies feel like bullet sponges, and the overall gameplay of just waiting for crystals to be charged is not fun in the slightest. And to top it all off, there are suicide guardians that if they blow up, they will one-shot you. As in, no fight for your life for your ass, it's just insta-death. The Maliwan takedown though is a glowing example on how you do it right. The takedowns are basically a really hard gauntlet that you go through while fighting mob enemies, and at halfway and the end you fight a raid boss that aren't quite as hard as a regular solo raid. After you beat the final boss of the takedown, you would reap your rewards, which, after everything was said and done in Borderlands 3, weren't really that great. If you're doing takedowns in BL3 nowadays, you're probably just testing out a build or doing it for fun. The rewards sucked, so that would need to be fixed going forward. And finally, we have the pre-sequel.
Wait, I thought you said the pre-sequel didn't have an endgame.
Well, yeah, it doesn't, but it did have the Holodome, best DLC of all time, any game, anywhere, Sorry, man, that keeps happening a lot recently. No, but for real, I just wanted to quickly mention the Holodome here, as it's going to be important later, but don't worry too much about it for now. And now that I've laid all the groundwork and context, we can finally get into the actual pitch. Okay, so you've just beat the story, say you've got to max level, and you find a side quest called You Will Die. Indubitably, it's Sir Hammerlock and is here to inform you that a rare beast is laying waste to Pandora and using an old Crimson Raider base as their lair. It's your job to take it out. Side quests like this will appear on all planets of the game, making one raid boss per planet, giving the endgame a good variety in endgame loot right off the bat. This is also relying on if we do interplanetary travel again like we did in BL3. I mean, why wouldn't we do it again, right? When you arrive at the raid boss's arena, to enter you have to pay a fair sum of Iridium to enter. Not an incredibly large sum, Borderlands 3, but a fair sum. Like how it was about 8 to 20 Iridium to fight most raid bosses in Borderlands 2. After you successfully killed the raid boss, you will find a new currency on the ground reminiscent of Seraph crystals from Borderlands 2, along with, if you're really lucky, a pearlescent gun, which will have a comically low drop rate and will not be possible to get outside of raids or takedowns. When handing in the quest, you will also receive a large amount of the new currency as well. It's worth noting that quests can't be repeated, but the raid of course can. But how much of the new currency do you get? Just enough in fact to unlock a takedown on the new menu accessible for the first time in the main hub, after of which you'll become a part of your menu for quality of life sake. This menu, while being able to purchase takedowns, also lets you spend your new currency on weapons that have a varying cost depending on their usefulness and strengths. For the sake of the video, I'm going to be calling this new rarity Opalescent and the new currency Opals. But continuing on, every takedown is based off of a different manufacturer and can be purchased for the same price, so that you can choose what guns you want to go after more. Completing a takedown for the first time will yield you the Company Man relic for the manufacturer of the respective takedown. Takedowns will also mostly have unique enemies to them. Told you this pitch was unrealistic, but don't worry, it gets worse. And as you're playing through them, a Vault Hunter from a previous game will be your guide, similar to how Tannis and Lorelei were in Borderlands 3's takedowns. This solves a major issue of having way too many characters to bring back into the story and even side quests. Fans weren't really happy with how Borderlands 3 handled it by just kind of slowly rolling them into DLCs. I feel like this way fans can still be mad chilling with Salvador, but without him or any of the other billions of Vault Hunters we've accumulated at this point needed for the main story stuff. This also answers where the hell the previous Vault Hunters are, because you could just say, Mose was getting revenge on her ex-Sergeant at Vladov trying to steal new Iron Bear parts. Or Athena, who is apparently the CEO of Hyperion now. Fucking, what the fuck, Gearbox? Wants to shut down the Pro-Jack resistance that have taken over a Hyperion facility. This is probably the most realistic part of this entire pitch, and I just really want to include it in Borderlands 4. Each takedown, like Borderlands 3, will have at least 2 bosses, one halfway through and one at the very end. Sometimes they can be mixed up, maybe one takedown has like 2 easier fights and then a third one, but you know, there's already enough work as it is, to be honest. After you defeat the final boss of each takedown, you will gain access to a loot room which will contain takedown exclusive loot, most of which will pertain to the manufacturer of said takedown. So that means more Vladov exclusive legendaries in the Vladov takedown and more Torg legendaries in the Torg takedown, etc. But in addition to those drops, you will also have a small chance to receive a pearlescent in the loot room. I'm thinking about a 1% chance, which I know sounds low, but you've got to remember the point is that they're rare, and they are the endgame reward for sinking your time into it. And besides, like, that's still way higher than any Borderlands 1 pearl drop source, so I think 1% is like actually a pretty balanced choice. And of course, you'll be rewarded with more opals to unlock more takedowns and purchase unique items. So that's the gameplay loop. Kill raid bosses to get opals and specific unique drops. Use those opals to purchase takedowns. Do the takedowns for a higher chance to get pearls, more unique gear, and more opals to buy opalescent gear. Then use your better gear to defeat the raid bosses and takedowns, and so the gameplay loop continues. But that's not all. No, I want Gearbox that not even have a slight chance of completing this endgame concept, because we're bringing back one last thing to make this endgame as perfect as it can possibly be. A little thing I like to call the overdome. In my head, the overdome is a combination of 3 forgotten or generally disliked ideas from past Borderlands endgames. And putting all their best attributes together to make something better than the sum of their parts individually. Those ideas being the Underdome from Borderlands 1, the Raid on Digistruct Peak from Borderlands 2, and of course, the Holodome from Borderlands the pre-sequel. I told you it was relevant, The idea for the Overdome is that it's a Digistruct version of the Underdome. So much so that as you're playing through the rounds, the environment and enemies you face will change in real time. The problem with a lot of the Slaughter Domes and Shafts is that they tend to drag for far too long, with not much changing between the rounds. I think that adding the variety from this and cutting down on the round's length and amount of waves will help players not get burnt out on the concept. Because let's be honest, an arena in Borderlands is a great idea, but it's never really quite fit in. I always found myself getting bored of doing the same thing over and over, especially in Borderlands 3's Slaughter Shaft and the Underdome. With the arena being fully digital, the Overdome will be able to recreate boss arenas and put in random mini-bosses that have dedicated drops, like DigiPeak had. The reward would be a bunch of chests, XP, and possibly a small amount of unique Overdome items. Other ideas I had for modes for the Overdome would include see how many rounds you can go for survival. That's rewards depend on how long you last, with the difficulty ramping up the longer you play. A mini arms race where you could start off with no gear at all, you need to scavenge the changing environment to get enough gear to survive the rounds and beat the boss at the end. I'll also put this here since I don't really know where to put it, but it's an idea that's been getting a lot of traction since K6 made a video on it. But the Overdome could include digi-recreations of past Vault Hunters as boss fights, since people really want to see that. And of course, one of the main reasons I wanted to include the Overdome, a raid boss rush mode. Instead of having to travel to every different raid post, which could take a lot of time in previous games,
Looking at you, Washburn Refinery!
you can now access every raid boss from the Overdome. I think you should have ample time to loot after you kill a raid boss, so I feel like the best way to make this raid boss rush work is to bring back the Wonderland's Chaos Chamber portals in some way, as to act as an I'm ready button to go to the next boss. Who knows, they could even bring back the Holo button back from the Holodome. Yeah, we brought it back again, let's go! But after you beat all raid bosses in the game, in the raid rush mode, you will be sent to a Nox-style armory where you only have a certain amount of time to loot as many chests as you can. Chests that have a much higher drop rate for pearls than anywhere else in the game. This provides an ultimate endgame challenge at the end of the endgame loop. One goal to get enough gear, do all takedowns, unlock every raid boss, and finally get a pearlescent of your own to just destroy the game with. Now I know that was a lot, and that it's far too much for Gearbox to feasibly make, and that nothing close to this will ever happen, but I wanted to lay out what my perfect endgame would be, so that I think a lot of this stuff could be rolled out slower, like Overdome modes in one update, and a new takedown pack of about like 3 in another, which is still quite a lot of work, I know, but like, you know, there are ways to space it out, but I'll admit, I did go a bit overboard, especially with the raid bosses. I mean, I did say there would be 1 on each planet, so that's say 4 base raids and then 9 takedowns, so that's like total of 13 raids at the very least in the raid boss rush according to my ideas here. But even though that's a lot of work and not really possible, it would still be my dream endgame for Borderlands 4. But let me know in the comments, do you personally have any ideas for a Borderlands 4 endgame? Do you agree with mine? And what do you think is most likely for Gearbox to do for a Borderlands endgame? I'm really passionate about this franchise, and this was just an incredibly fun video to make. I mean, on raid boss concepts alone, I could go on for ages, but I'll have to save that for another time. And Gearbox, yes, you can use any of the ideas in this video, as long as you give me credit, give me money, give me Borderlands 4 early, right? You could do that. Or make new Tales not canon anymore. Yeah, that's right, got my fucking bargaining chips on the table, let's go! But yeah, like and subscribe, join the Discord if you can, and I'll see you in the next video.